But now at, 65, I find myself intrigued with this notion of dropping deeply into the beingness of my nature, and often in conversation with others like yourself who are similarly exploring the internal worlds of who we are and what does it mean to be aligned with this life force that is, surging through our bodies, and how we care for that, and how we express that, and how we nurture that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reflections on Living Well podcast, where we explore perspectives on the good life in the 21st century. I am your host, Broderick. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Reflections on Living Well podcast. Today, our guest is Reverend Victor Kazanjian. Victor is a mentor, coach, and consultant, helping individuals and organizations to achieve their goals and actualize their aspirations through a holistic approach to leadership, life, and learning. He teaches that integrated and effective leaders serve as midwives, enabling others to birth their creative potential. He retired in 2022 as the Executive Director of the United Religions Initiative, a global grassroots intercultural and interfaith peacebuilding network of more than 1,000 groups working in over 100 countries to build bridges of cooperation between people of all beliefs and cultures. Prior to joining the United Religious Initiative, Victor served for 2 decades as Dean of Intercultural Education, Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life, and co-director of the Peace and Justice Studies program at Wellesley College. Victor is an ordained priest in the Episcopal Church with a daily practice of Buddhist meditation, yoga, qigong, and kirtan. Hi, Victor.
Hi, Broderick.
How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. So audience, Victor has become a dear friend, mentor, teacher, and just a lovely human being. And we've been having some conversations as of late, and they've been wonderful. And I thought it would be great to have Victor here on the podcast to enlighten us all with his knowledge and wisdom, and his love for life and love for people. And I'm just really excited to always love to talk with you, but excited that the rest of the world gets to tune into some of our dialogues, our conversations.
I love our conversations. They inspire me.
Yeah, me too, big time. I know I just read that introduction, but it's nothing better than someone introducing themselves. So can you briefly introduce yourself, say a little bit about you?
Sure. So these days I think of myself as a human actively striving to live fully in the present. All of the work, the vocation, the life that has led up to this moment is a part of my story. It's part of who I am, but it's who I am is more than that too. And so I think in addition to having been a priest and an educator and a teacher and peace builder and all those things, I feel like a novice again, learning to try to be present in life and try to be fully in this space of my being, my body, as I live out here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with my wife, and in the beauty of the mountains and the trails and the sibling plants and animals and all of this world. So a novice trying to live fully in the present, I guess, is how I describe myself.
I love it. It's almost like that beginner's mind mentality of, I guess that's great because it allows you to to be open, receptive to kind of what's here, what's out there, and listening, having a mentality of a beginner or novice is being open to listening and
Thanks.
witnessing what's out
Yeah.
there.
I think having so often we spend our lives being defined by the external world, what we've accomplished, what we do, our doing, rather than our being. And I feel blessed and inspired that at this point in life, I'm able to really drop into that space of being more, and which is disorienting because we're so oriented towards the external world and what feedback we get from our work and our identities and all of this. So it feels like a really rich and extraordinary time, and living well, as you so beautifully are creating a space for, feels to me these days like living in the present as fully as I can.
Lovely. I love it. Love it. So let's just jump right on in.
Right.
So what does living well mean to you? Let's dig into what that means to you, and then we'll just unpack it for the rest of this conversation. So that's kind of how it goes here.
Great. Yeah, at the moment it is definitely about being and not so much the doing. And having spent a life of doing, which I enjoyed and which I look back on with satisfaction and a sense of fulfillment. I also realized that there was a lot of my living that was living in places of anxiety and places of fear and places of uncertainty and places of regret. And so I think living in the present in part means not living in the past and not living in the future. And so the degree to which in my various roles I found myself both thinking about the past and sort of learning from the past, but also being a little bit fixated on the past, and then also the future, took me out of a space of being fully in the present. I think those times that I was most in the present during my vocational parts of my life were around moments of life crisis or life urgency or life ritual, birth, death, illness, these human things that call us deep into the present moment, just to be present either with someone else or with one's self. So that was always been a part of my vocation, but I also realized that in part I wasn't really living at all, in as much as I was attached to the past or consumed by the future. That's, to me, that's not living. Living has become making full use of this limited time that I have in this body, in which my life force inhabits for a while, as I walk upon this earth. And what does that mean to drop deep into that sense of being and that sort of beingness? My dad, who was a beautiful, gentle, loving man, but also trained in the world of doing, and that to be worthy of this life, one had to do in a certain way. And he often would say, what have you done today to justify your existence? What have you done today to justify your existence? And now I think about how often he said that, and it makes me sad, as though we need to justify our very existence in some way. And so that orientation towards doing, towards, whether, and it could be good doing, it could be, I spent a lot of my life in justice and peace and working for helping others. And those are good things we all, should do in part. But now at, 65, I find myself intrigued with this notion of dropping deeply into the beingness of my nature, and often in conversation with others like yourself who are similarly exploring the internal worlds of who we are and what does it mean to be aligned with this life force that is, surging through our bodies, and how we care for that, and how we express that, and how we nurture that. So those are the big aspects for me of living well right now. And that could be on the hiking trails. It could be, meditation. It could be singing. It could be playing guitar. It could be, all these things that our body activates, and yet also has the potential to have us experience the sort of, the original oneness with our consciousness, with our life force.
Oh, that's so beautifully said. There's a lot of pieces in that I hope we can explore. Yeah, just lovely. I love that because we do, particularly in our culture, we focus so much on productivity. And the way that our educational system is set up is to encourage us to produce, to do. And even also no, you're the priest, and you might know a lot more about the Christian history than I do. But isn't it the Calvinistic Christian? Is it Calvin or no, not Calvin? Whichever one. That's just do, work, to achieve. That mentality is so invested in this country, and there are benefits to that. We're pretty, according to GDP, we're a pretty industrious society in our country, and there are things that needs to be produced. That's great, but at what price?
Yeah.
Like you said, we're not paying attention to this spaciousness of the present moment. We're not really being in the world. We're so focused on doing, creating stuff, producing stuff, and we neglect this aspect of ourselves that is hard to pinpoint and put into some box. Yeah. We do it all the time, right? When you meet someone, what do you do?
Yeah.
What's your job? What work do you do in the world?
Yeah.
And we can neglect that, and we forget that there's so many benefits to being that helps us in the doing anyway.
Yeah. No, it's funny. When I lived on the East Coast, people would introduce themselves and say, what do you do? And where'd you go to school? I mean, that was like the sort of, and then I lived on the West Coast, and it's definitely like, what are you doing? What do you do? And, what did you create? What did you, what work do you create? And in Santa Fe, it's like, what do you love doing? Or what do you love about life? I'll put it that way. What do you love about life? And it's a different question. And the first questions to me all relate our identity or our beingness to the external. How have we related to the world in whatever ways? And that's obviously a part of us. But the last one is more about, what's inside. Not how do you, I am because I am this in the world. I had a very funny experience. I play golf as a spiritual practice, not as a country club exercise. And I love it. And I was out on the golf course with one of my friends. And we had just met, and sort of, he came to the golf course very excited. And he came up to me and he said, I looked you up online and you used to be somebody. And I laughed. I said, that is such a beautiful and wild description. Because, all those things online were things I did in the world. But I really like who I am now, which is a much more internally focused, much more contemplative person. I'm really happy with who I have become in this shape and form, and my just being in the world now without necessarily the external affirmation of that. And so I just laughed because it was such a beautiful illustration of how we often think of the worthiness of our humanity is somehow defined externally. And that there are other ways. I mean, this great spiritual traditions of the world often point to another path, which is the deepening journey, the inward journey, the coming to know oneself, coming to know the great beingness of consciousness through the journey into oneself. And that is so different than the sort of Western vocational world. And having been in higher education for so many years and worried that part of what we were teaching students was that their worthiness was externally defined. Their worthiness was solely externally defined. And that leaves a great hole. Leaves a great hole inside. And I think that's a huge problem in our culture, that we've become detached from our original sense of connectedness, our consciousness, our worth of just the life force as being worthy enough in us. So that's still a concern for me about our world and our sisters and brothers who struggle with that disconnect from their own essential self-worth or sense of belonging internally.
Yeah, isn't it ironic? And I think that how we express ourselves in the external world says a lot about who we are, or says a lot about how we see things in the world, how we perceive ourselves in the world. And in that, you can learn a lot about a person based on that. But when we overly emphasize those external expressions of ourselves, and we're emphasizing that external expression of ourselves, and we define ourselves by it, but then and this is inevitable. You live in a society, and society has a culture, and the culture sets the standard for what is to be celebrated, what is to be rewarded, and you try to accommodate that. We all try to accommodate that in the external world, and it is heavily influenced by the amount of money we can make. And so we end up doing things to satisfy and externally generated now that we agree upon. We agree with it, but we just externally generated notion of what it means to be a person in the world. And we fail to look inside of ourselves and be with ourselves because it's already been externally defined, and we have to figure out a way to fit ourselves within that structure some way, somehow. Now, some of us find something that we enjoy. We find like, oh, I'm passionate about this particular thing. Yet we're still looking for that external validation. We're still trying to fit it within the external structure that's available to us. And one of the reasons why I'm saying this is because you are in the university teaching in the religious, spiritual, cultural dimension of, essentially, you would think that subject matter would emphasize the more being aspect of us. But if you're concerned about that, and I get it, because some people go there and they're like, oh, I'm very much interested in religious studies, and my heart is drawn to spirituality, so I'm going to go to divinity school and become this, I don't know, a priest or something, and be a theologian, and that I'm externally identified with that. I'm going to fit myself into this structure that gives me a sense of self that has some value, that is being determined by the external world. So I've kind of lost sense of what it is that's really driving me towards spirituality, and I'm caught up in being placeholder in this external structure that's created by the culture, even though it isn't something that I like to do, something that I'm have some passion for. I've still lost touch or connection with myself
Yes.
because I am still being externally defined. I just think that's so interesting. And then you have probably the majority of us are just completely, we're like, well, I can't worry about what I love to do. I need to go and do what's necessary for me to fit within this structure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very interesting situation I think we find ourselves in.
It is, and it's interesting. I think of a couple of things. In my first parish that I worked in was in the South Bronx in New York, and it was the most one of the poorest, economically poorest urban communities in the country. I learned so much about deep spirituality from the community members, from the people in my parish there, who were basically excluded from their identities being defined by success in the vocational world by virtue of the poverty, the economic poverty in which they live, and the lack of opportunity. And yet there was a deepening and a connectedness around the kindness and compassion and care for one another and care for one's self that I learned during that time. While people who were in other communities that I've worked that had all kinds of external things, economic things, success and vocations, I experience as being profoundly detached from that sense of inner beingness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the spiritual traditions teach is often the things we accumulate are burdens to our becoming. They accentuate the doing, they accentuate the accumulation of wealth or of material things. That often is a burden to the our deep beingness. I had a student who, in my peace studies class, who was a brilliant student at Wellesley College, and she was amazing and an incredible student. 4 years, majored in peace studies, and a week before graduation, she came to me and she said, "Could you list me in the graduation program as being an economics major?" And I said, "Why would I do that? You're a peace studies major. You've been a peace studies major all, since you came here." She said, "Well, I've never told my parents that I'm a peace studies major, and they will think I have wasted my education if I don't tell them, I don't show them that I was actually an economics major." I said, "Oh, well, we need to have a long talk because this is a moment of learning for you." And a good moment for you to talk to your family about this. The other thing for me, and it always is a semi-obvious thing for me when I speak, is that one of the great teachers in my life has been my stuttering. That since I was a little boy, started to speak at 2 years old, I was a very severe stutterer, and so the speech impediment that has always been part of my beingness was also a barrier to me having some of those external affirmations that would have perhaps led me down a path of being solely externally focused. But as a young boy and a severe stutterer, it pushed me internally to figure out how to hold a space within myself, love myself, regardless of what was coming at me from the outside, which was often humiliating, right? And it was often that sort of the laughter or the teasing or the whatever it is that people out of their own nervousness or insecurity react to around stutterers. And so to be able to have this early experience of needing to find some internal footing, a place to stand and rest within myself, even in the face of external humiliation rather than success, was one of the greatest, most painful, but greatest spiritual lessons I think I ever had. And I look back on those days and that little boy, and what he went through and what he developed as a foundation for what I'm doing now, which is to go back into the into the internal world and to explore and to make a home for myself in a more contemplative way without the external affirmations. And so that's been an interesting life journey for me. And in some sense, living well has meant letting go of any notion of perfection. And the stuttering was the great teacher around this. So I often talk about my sort of life ethic as being one of seeking wholeness, not seeking perfection, and that wholeness and perfection are different things. Wholeness includes all of the ways in which we are in our humanity are imperfect, we struggle physically, mentally, spiritually, and that's part of the beauty of our beingness, of how the life force is expressing itself through us. And so, from having been a very public figure for my adult life, now being a much more contemplative soul is fascinating. It's sometimes, mostly it's wonderful. Sometimes it's strange because it is, but I find myself, along with my partner and wife Michelle, who was also in higher education and is now teaches yoga and is a energy healer and shamanic healer. The two of us have gone from very public external vocational lives, which were wonderful and we enjoyed and loved, to now very contemplative, internally focused lives. And it's been a wonderful new part of the journey to really unfold that.
Beautiful. Oh, thank you for sharing all that. So much there. So encouraging for me. I need to hear that more and more, I think, as I consistently navigate this experience of being a human being and, wanting to always focus primarily on the contemplative aspect of who I am. That's just, I love that. That's what motivates me. I love the contemplative practice, self-exploration, the inner life. Of course, I like doing. I'm an active person, like going out doing stuff, and that's perfectly well. But I love that. I love that being how much you're emphasizing the importance of that.
Yeah.
You've had a remarkable career in doing, and you loved it. Yet this aspect of your life is even much more rewarding. That's good for me to hear, because I've always tried to emphasize that in the work that I do in the world. For instance, because of what I'm calling external structures are looking for success that's determined by the external world. A lot of times when I wanting to teach yoga, meditation, and these things, there's this strong emphasis on branding. And what are we doing when we're branding? We're creating an external depiction of ourselves that's not really who we are. It's just a way to convince people to come see you. I do understand that. I see why that has value. But what I've seen, Victor, is that excuse me, people overly emphasize that.
Yeah.
It becomes a thing. I am this spiritual teacher. I am this priest, monk, imam, I don't know, whatever tradition that one may be a part of, or atheist. I'm an atheist who's interested in, I'm a humanist, and I'm this and I'm all of these different things. And we try to market ourselves in this external marketplace as this thing, and we end up losing sight of who we really are.
Yep.
And that story of that young woman who didn't want to tell her parents that she was a peace studies major, I get it.
Yeah.
We're constantly being conditioned. Even if she decided to do that, she's probably going to, she would probably, if someone doesn't guide her, create an external, fictitious sense of a self to market to the world as a peace studies person, as a person of peace.
Yep.
I am this character that's trying to fit within the external world. Do we have to do that to some extent to navigate? Sure. Yep. But finding a delicate balance where we don't overly sacrifice our purpose, our inner drive, that thing that's motivating us, that's the thing that's inspiring us to do this particular work. We get caught in doing the work for the sake of that character, so we can find success relative to what the culture and society suggests that success is.
Exactly.
And so we're not doing it for the sake of doing it. We're not working, say, as a peace activist, say as a yogi, say as a person like me it's hard to put me in a box, but, using this yogic system, a yogic way of thinking, or coming from a yogic perspective, how do we evolve and develop our consciousness to minimize suffering, to maximize well-being and more love in the world?
Yeah.
My desire is to do that that's me. I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to do that for the sake of doing it, not so I can fit within some category outside of myself within the external structure. Has that been challenging for me? Yes. Because I see the trap of putting myself in this external box to satisfy everybody else.
Yeah.
Because I can see how I can lose doing this work for the sake of doing it.
Yes.
From the depths of my soul, from a place of pure love, man, is why I do it. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose that for a brand. I don't want to lose that so I can fit within some external structure. So I've been willing to you know what? I'm just going to do it, and the right people gravitate towards me.
Yeah, I love that.
And finding a delicate balance, because what you're saying to me validates that for me. And you know what? Screw that. I'm going to keep doing it, because every time I would try to put myself into that external box and say I'm this thing, and I'm the breathing guy, and be known as the breathing guy, and I get followers for being the breathing guy, and I'm like, no, that's not who I am. I teach a lot of breathing exercise and do a lot of breathing exercise. That's only one piece of a puzzle for something else that is richer and deeper. And so I just see that. I see how we can get lost in that external validation and lose sight of doing the work for the sake of the work itself.
Yeah.
Loving the world for the sake of love itself, versus loving the world so I can be known as a lover of the world. That's very different.
It's very well said, and it's so important. And I think for me, as a young person, as a child, in a family where success was very important in any way. I mean, they were all social justice people and civil rights, and so I had wonderful mentors in the sort of expression of meaning, and the other part of it were doctors and helping people. Great. But then there's this question that I think I didn't realize until I had children of my own, which was I was attaching being loved to being successful in those ways. It's some part of me felt like I would only be fully loved and accepted if I met these certain external standards, if I met the expectations of the people who I loved and who loved me. Having children brought that into stark relief because I realized that I started doing the same thing to them, that I was doing using the same language that sounded a little like my love was contingent upon. And yet I felt this absolutely unconditional love for my boys. And now I have granddaughters, and they're like, again, I'm going through that experience of this love, 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 love. And it's not contingent upon who they become, what they do, how they succeed. It is not. And so being able to flip that towards oneself, to love oneself as though one was loving one's grandchild, one's child, without, for who they are, not for what they do. Mm-hmm. That's huge. And that was sort of life learnings that I continue to have around what does that feel like? I know what I want them to feel like. I want them to feel accepted and loved and cared for and unique and beautiful and just for who they are. Do I apply that to me? Do I love myself in the same way? And, there's this whole thing, and particularly in the sort of the West, the Christian West, let's say, that I know best in terms of my own original religion of origin, there's this sense of being, selfish, that to being self-centered is a bad thing, is something that is, takes you down a path that is detached from this sort of serving others. But there's a different way to put it. It's not self-centered. It's being centered in self. And if the self is this unique expression of the great life force that we call by so many names, inhabiting me as an individual, then I can be devout in my love for the great life force by loving myself, by being centered in myself, not in a selfish way, but really working to align and ground and clear the clutter from within me so that that life force flows fully through me. And, I think we have such natural examples of this in the natural world around us. I think we think of ourselves as human beings way too often as being the most advanced of life forms, and boy, are we not. And there are so many lessons to learn, I think, from the natural world, from sibling animals and sibling plants that are around us, about how that energy flows, about how the life force flows naturally through. And one of the great gifts, I think, of humanity is our consciousness, our self-reflective consciousness. It also is a curse because it comes with this sort of tendency towards aligning ourselves with externality, with external validation, rather than doing the deepening internal work. Now, the Eastern religious spiritual worlds tend more towards the internal. They're not perfect in any way in terms of how they engage that. But I do think that the seeing as sacred, as beautiful, as divine, the life energy that we are privileged to have flowing through us for a time, and wanting to tend to that like one tends a garden. It's like, how do we cultivate that? And when it's all moved externally and all defined externally, I think the garden dries up. It's, the Howard Thurman, I think, who was one of my great gurus, once said that spirituality is the water that waters our roots, the roots of our lives. And so spiritual practice, whatever it is essential for growing the garden, for keeping the life force flowing through the seasons, through the winter when things are, fallow, and through the spring when things are growing again, and all these parts of our lives that ebb and flow. So I think that to me has become much more of a focus in living well, is the being sure that the majority of my energy is spent tending that flow, the life force, so that it flows out. I mean, it flows out to the people I love. It flows out to the people I care about in the world. That flows out to the world itself, and wanting a more just and humane and peaceful world. But it also flows back and waters again. It's sort of that flow. And so, that's sort of the grand process.
I love it. I love it. I love that nuance. You threw it in there quickly, but it's so nuanced and important. And again, folks, words, language are imperfect, but this is what I love about contemplative practice. It's not analytic philosophy. Lord help us on that one. And it's like the play of words that you're using there. Like some people we can be selfish and self-centered. And we know what that means. We're referring to a person who is not self-centered, actually. Like you're saying, actually, they are, and like a narcissist. They are self-centered and selfish. The world evolves around them.
Yeah.
And they are looking for, ironically, external validation for who they are, searching for that.
Yeah.
And wanting the world to know, look at me, I am special.
Yeah.
But in what you're saying, that subtle difference is being centered in yourself. To really, truly be, you have to be, because you're not worried about external validation. You're not looking for the world to determine your success. You're looking inside of yourself. You're nurturing and supporting the garden of who you are. We're all an expression of the divine. That's the way I see it as well. And when we care for that, when we care for our soul, when we care for ourselves, when we nurture and support ourselves so that we can be a beauty, a light unto the world.
Yeah.
And if we deny that, when we don't center that, not being, quote, I know it's a play of words, not being selfish and all about me, it's about, let me nurture and support the spirit that is expressing itself through me.
Yeah.
Let me center myself in that. When I do that, I care for myself. I nurture, I support myself. I take care of my health for the sake of the divine, for the sake of the spirit that is percolating through me, or the spirit that is an expression of, that I am an expression of. I am nurturing and supporting that, because when I do that, I bring my gifts and talents to the world.
Yeah.
I bring to the world the beauty that I am called to express into the world. Yeah. I bring my vocation into the world from an internal space that hasn't been externally defined. Now, I bring that into the world and I illuminate that into the world and share that with others in this external world. You can put it in a box however they want to. It doesn't matter.
That's right.
The important thing is that I am nurturing and supporting the garden. I'll say, each one of us like a mini garden. I'm supporting the garden of myself. Yeah. I'm nurturing it. I'm caring for it. I'm doing whatever I can so that we can use a Christian word language, so God can operate through me. Yeah. So God's work can illuminate through me, or the spirit or the divine, or my life purpose, or whatever language one wants to use. And that is so important. It is counterintuitive to, and some people take it that way. They completely take what we're saying and like, oh yeah, now it's all about me. And then I'm going to project myself into this externally defined structure or category. And then I'm going to create a category so that the external world can validate me. Versus, no, I'm going to nurture this spirit. I'm going to be centered in a self, the big self, a self that is expressing it to the divine, that is expressing itself through me. I have direct access to that more than anything else. So it behooves me. It's my duty. It's my duty to be contemplative, to be self-reflective, to dig into it, to listen deeply, so that I can bring about whatever my gifts and talents is in the world. And in the Eastern tradition, they talk about your dharma, your work in the world, your way. What are your gifts and talents? Now, how do you illuminate that and bring that to life? And when we don't give adequate enough attention to our core self, again, we're playing with language. If you're confused, there's some deeper aspect of ourselves. When we give full attention to that, like you're saying, then we're happier. We can bring about more love in the world. We can bring about more well-being in the world, because we've given ourselves the opportunity to nurture something that's ultimately greater than any category that we can even create. If we really do it, we'll see that I'm not just Broderick. Broderick is just a false representation of something that's bigger than what Broderick can ever be when we do this contemplative work that you're talking about.
I totally agree. And when we, the sort of shadow path that so often happens is that people become disconnected from that sense of deep belonging, deep at homeness with oneself. Everything gets projected onto the outside world, so that they need to consume, whether it's consume material things or to consume other people's accolades for them. I mean, they become dependent upon, hungry for that external affirmation, because there's an emptiness, there's a hole. Humans develop superiorities to cover that. I am better than these other people because, for whatever category that is, because I'm trying to fill that hole, that disconnect, by lifting myself up artificially, by creating superiorities. Religions have done the same thing by creating exclusive notions of truth, which is, absurd. I think what happens, another positive piece of being grounded in that sense of deep connection, is we become curious. Our orientation to the world is one of curiosity. We meet another person, and we don't have to spend our energy trying to establish ourselves for this other person. We are curious about them, and that the differences between us are even more interesting, because we become even more curious about different cultures, different religions, different races, different genders, different ways in which people express the life force. And so curiosity is a beautiful expression of a contemplative connection. So it's not, people confuse contemplative as being isolated, being isolationist. It's not. For me, the contemplative world has expressed itself, birthed itself into this notion of curiosity. And, one of the things that I've come to work with a lot of folks on now, and a lot of my work now is on one-on-one conversations, conversational partnerships. And I do think of myself as practicing a form of being a midwife, a sort of spiritual midwife, where my role is to help others to birth their own creative potential. It's not my baby. It's their creative potential. It's their unique life expression of the life force. And I'm just a midwife who helps that birthing process. And whether that birthing process is a life well lived, whether it's an expression through vocation, expression through a piece of writing, whatever it is. I love that work, that vocation, inspired by the midwives of old, the women who sort of held this sacred practice of bringing life into the world, and were often demonized and isolated for doing that, for having this perceived power. But those standing in the lineage of midwives, whose vocation is not to promote themselves, whose vocation is not to lift up self, but to help the creative life force continue to birth into the world, whether it be as a human or an idea or an expression of the creative self.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love most.
Oh, I love it. I love it. This is so awesome. And yeah, this is it. I think that I want to make sure I emphasize before we finish this conversation and re-emphasize really that when we do this, like when you're midwifing people, I do a similar thing. I have my thing is a whole training program. I want to train you, get you in the favor, help make the favorable conditions for this to happen. And when we're doing that, and if we're coming from that place too of like, I'm doing this as my calling for the sake of doing it itself. And when we do that for others and we can support others when others do that, I think that you naturally you want to do good.
Mm-hmm.
You want to see goodness in the world, because when you really do that, you're coming from a place that's so deep and rich that you realize your connection with everything else. You realize your interdependency, your interbeing, your interbecoming with the whole universe. And with that realization, you inevitably will love, I feel. I think you can still teach that too, the importance of building relations and connection and seeing that connection, practicing, realizing that connection with another being. But it's not about being a selfish person at all. It's all about becoming a vehicle, in the language that I like to use, a vehicle for goodness, a vehicle for beauty, a vehicle for love, a vehicle for kindness, a vehicle for compassion. These qualities, these characteristics associated with a realization or a manifestation of spirit or the divine or God, whatever language one wants to use, that when we behave in that way, I feel like it requires us to do what you're speaking of.
Yeah.
And we're doing it for the sake of doing it itself. In the Greek tradition, Aristotle or Socrates or whatever, I think probably all of them really, not all of them, but those who I mentioned, Plato, I guess. You're doing good for good itself. You're not trying to be a virtuous person to fit within some category so everyone can say that you're a virtuous person. That's not what this is about. It's about learning how to be, and through your being, express your becoming in the world, your doing in the world, from a very rich place that you don't even care what people think.
Yeah.
You don't want to, you're not trying to fit within a box, within a category. And this is what happens with gurus or fake gurus or people, or priests, preachers, or whoever who fall from grace. Now, we all have that potential because we're imperfect. But a lot of times they're putting themselves in the category, I'm the guru. And it's not coming from a deep place. They're not doing the good or the teaching or whatever it is they're doing, or the preaching from that really authentic place. They're doing it for social status. They're doing it for external validation or power or whatever it may be. You're inevitably going to fall from grace when you do that. And I think,
No, and I think a piece of that, I totally agree. And I think a piece of that is also, it flows from the pain of inner disconnectedness and inner alienation.
Exactly.
And so if we never attend to that alienation, that sense of connectedness, we are therefore always projecting that out into the world. So the violence that is done is a direct expression of, I think, that inner alienation, that inner disconnect that then becomes traumatized and becomes the source of angst and pain. And in order to not deal with the pain, we seek power over others so that it somehow numbs that. It's that place where, doing the good works doing has to flow from the beingness, right? From the inner beingness, from the inner love. And that's the sort of denial of self, the theologies that I think were created out of a complete lack of understanding the inner life, but that focused on fear, sort of a fear-based systems of trying to get people to behave a certain way, missed the whole point of the great spiritual teachers, that it flows from the life force, from the divine within, from this place of which has to be nourished. It has to be cared for. And when it is cared for, then you see this beauty of the people who express in whatever they do in the world, whatever their vocation is. It can be simple and small in terms of worldly terms, but it's beautiful and loving, and it can be big for those whose life force wants to express itself in those ways. But if it doesn't flow from that sense of connected beingness with the life force, of inner belonging, of inner alignment, then it risks being simply a projection of pain. And I think we see that all over our world today. And the then attempts to sort of battle the politics of our lives becomes a battleground over doing and doing one thing or another, and without ever addressing the issue of being, the issue of the deeper place from which all that flows. So
beautiful. I love that. And I think an important piece of the puzzle, folks, is, yes, we're speaking of that now. And how do we now? We're doing this inner work, realizing this interconnection, really building that interconnection. I think that how we get there is through some form of training, practice, education, be it yogic, spiritual exercise, whatever exercise. I call it all yogic, the yogic exercises, because yoga is really an exercise kit for liberating oneself and growth and development towards one's divine nature. That's the language that I'm using. So you need something to support that. And also what you need to, folks, is when we do that, it behooves us to understand the world that we live in. You have the education. Education is the means by which we can illuminate our being into doing. When we learn about the world that we inhabit, we learn how we got here, we can understand how to navigate the world of doing. Becoming is an important part of it. We're evolving, developing. That's important. But we're learning how to support that becoming, that development, that doing in the world from that deep, rich place that you're speaking of. So how do we do that? Through learning, through education, learning about the world, learning as much as we can about the world, about ourselves, about our physical bodies, how it works, the language game that I'm playing in my culture, in my society. And now we live in a global world, understanding the language game of the global, quote unquote, politics or whatever. What is happening in the world? What is my relationship to all these things? Now, how do I bring my divine nature, my inner being into the world in action? How does that show up? So you have to do some form of educating yourself. Because what happens if, for instance, if you are in a dogmatic tradition, whatever that tradition is, so I don't want to pick on just religion. Let's say it's a dogmatic atheistic religion. Not religion. Well, it is religious, but an atheistic tradition that's super dogmatic. And you coming from this internal place, and that's all you know is that one dogmatic worldview. When you try to express that becoming in the world, it's tainted by that narrow-minded, dogmatic perspective. And that's why it's important to educate ourselves and not get trapped into dogmatic perspectives, because it can taint us possibly, and it can be hard to look beyond it. There are many people in various traditions who are coming from a very core, rich spiritual place, but get trapped into that tradition and end up doing and behaving in ways that they think is good. It's not good for others and not good for the world, because they've not been able to expand their worldview, expand their capacity to see the complexity of the world. So that's an important piece of the puzzle that I try to emphasize in the work that I do, but also in this podcast. Like, just because I'm doing the internal contemplative work doesn't mean I disregard learning about the world. Actually, it is going to be even just as much important to learn about how the world works so I can better bring my goodness into the world, my love into the world.
Yeah.
Because if I'm trying to do it within a very constricted, narrowed way of seeing things, I can end up unconsciously, and I think we all do this to a capacity anyway, because we're all limited, doing more hurt than we really want to do.
Yeah.
Doing more harm than we really think we really want to do.
Yeah.
And we do that out of ignorance.
Yeah.
And we're all are embedded in a world of ignorance. My thing is, we do the best that we can to overcome the ignorance of our own divine nature, and also overcome the ignorance of how we are navigating or expressing ourselves within a world of other beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that we do that. Mm-hmm. And if we do those things, then we can better express goodness, love, and all these various positive qualities in the world.
Yeah. Right. So that's beautifully said. Beautifully said. And we can better express it because, as you said earlier, the inner work that we do combined with the curiosity that then leads to learning about the world opens the flow, opens the channel through which the great consciousness of the universe, the great energy forces flow through us. We become that sort of open channel. It's not about us. It's not about us ultimately. It's about something that's greater than us, but of which we make ourselves available as a channel of unique expression, because each human is unique in beautiful ways. And so discovering that expression, whether again, and these are not just vocational expressions, these are life expressions of how well we love and how well we give and how well we care for those in our intimate circles as well. So I think that is such a beautiful practice. And I think those who cut that off, those who create dogmas based on fear, those who, whatever it is, they've given up on the divine spirit. Mm-hmm. They fundamentally have given up on the belief that there is this great consciousness that flows through us, this life energy, whatever we call it, that we are a custodian for a time as we walk on this planet, and we're an expression of. It is also what connects us to each other. Yeah. So that the illusion that we're separate beings from each other in some fundamental way is one of the great tragedies of humankind, that in fact, and ancients knew this, that we are connected not just to other humans, but to all living things. And Einstein was probably the most famous person who proclaimed this, that it's the sort of delusion of separation. We're actually not separate. Now the people in quantum physics are teaching us, they are affirming this, that the ancients knew, that in fact we are not separate. There's energy flowing between us all the time. We're more connected than we're not. So all of these prejudices that have formed around the delusion of separation are just that. They are delusory. They are illusions. When in fact we share this beautiful energetic connection that we can know within, we can know without. The worlds within and the worlds without are ours to explore with curiosity and love. Yes.
Thank you for bringing back that curiosity. Yes, that curiosity leads to education and learning. And I want to say something, we're going to close in a minute, but you mentioned something earlier, and I've been holding off to say it because I think it's all tied in. Contemplative practice, as you know, and going to school, you're an educator as well, requires some form of discipline. Mm-hmm. And what discipline does is provides you structure, and it creates boundaries and limits. You place limits on yourself. And you mentioned earlier, and so when you play, sometimes when we place discipline can be uncomfortable. Let's say that. We don't necessarily like the comfort of putting boundaries on ourselves. And so when you were a child, you're stuttering was a discipline that you didn't ask for. Mm-hmm. But that discipline, that structure that was placed on you force you to go inside.
Mm-hmm.
You were, and I think a lot of us, each one of us have challenges that can force us to be a little bit more internally reflective. And you took advantage of, consciously or not, you took advantage of your stuttering issue to look inside,
Mm-hmm.
to get to know you a little bit more. Now, some people, it doesn't work out well for them for various reasons we can't unpack right now. But I'm breaking that up to say that sometimes suffering, discomfort, restraint can lead to a deeper understanding, because it forces us to look at life differently. And the contemplative practices, the practice of a yogi, is exercising or taking advantage of the use of discipline, limiting oneself, creating boundaries and limits on oneself, so one can take a deeper look at an aspect of oneself. For instance, say you're doing a meditation practice, and say this meditation practice is concentrating on something internally. I don't know, say this is something simple, the flow of the breath. And you discipline yourself to keep coming back to the flow of the breath. It's not always, those of us who do it, especially in the beginning, it's not comfortable. It can be challenging. Like, why am I doing this? This is crazy. This doesn't feel good.
Yep.
You keep coming back. Your body hurting. You don't want to sit still. You want to move. But you create a constraint on yourself. It's almost like a little subtle suffering in the context of discomfort. You create a little discomfort so you can focus the mind, focus the attention, in this case on breathing.
Yeah.
And that focusing on breathing helps you learn how to have a concentrated, focused mind in general. Now you take that capacity to focus and concentrate the mind, and then actually in the practice of doing it, you discover all kinds of things about the nature of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that practice, you can take that and use that and apply that in different situations. Yeah. You may have use a different meditative technique where you're using your capacity to concentrate and focus on just being really present and listening to something deeper inside of yourself. Yeah. So there's an idea of, again, discipline, practice. I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, it's everything is just loosey-goosey, just do whatever. No. Restraint and discipline is an important piece of this work that we're talking about. Contemplation, contemplative practice is a form of discipline. You said golf is a practice, it's your spiritual practice now. You're not just on the golf course just hitting the ball everywhere, just hitting the ball, hitting people with the stick. No, there's a discipline, there's a structure. You use and apply that structure to facilitate a particular type of experience.
And that experience, I love that. And that experience, which is one, ironically for me at this point in life, which does the physical activity that aligns mind, body, and spirit, is this ancient, wonderful Scottish sport of golf. But it is about awareness. Mm-hmm. So discipline is not punishment. It's not to produce fear. It's produce awareness that also produces a sense of joy of life. Not necessarily accomplishment, not necessarily success in the ways that, but it produces an awareness, an inner alignment. And also that is joyful. And I think the joyful piece of it is a piece that too often gets missed by religious discipline practice or other forms of practice, that there is a joy in really becoming aware of self, of other, of this world, and the noise, to cut through the noise of that surrounds us all the time. It does require, as you say, that sort of practice, discipline practice of some sort, And
listeners too, I want to say this. This conversation that Victor and I are having is a practice. To me, it's a spiritual practice. It's a practice of we're disciplining the conversation. We say, well, let's have this conversation about goodness, a life worthy of living. Let's explore this subject. We restrict the conversation to that particular subject. And as you've seen throughout this conversation, all kinds of things come into it, but we keep coming back. Just like a meditation, we keep coming back to that central thing. Even if we don't say the words living well every time, this conversation is centered around that. We're really present with each other. We're really listening to each other. We're trying to understand one another. I'm not trying to have an argument here. I'm not having a debate. We're just exploring. We're being creative. We're curious with one another. These things that we're talking about, this is a practice. And I encourage you all. Hopefully you've experienced that throughout listening to this conversation. But really important for me is to really encourage you all, have these conversations with folks. I'm not saying it's wrong to debate. You can have any conversation you want. I'm just encouraging, have this type of disciplined conversation with someone else about what is this living well thing. Let's just play with this. Let's just sit and really listen to each other. Let's try to compliment each other in the conversation, not faking it. If you disagree, say that you disagree, and say, how does that feel when you say that? What do you mean? Clarify that what you're saying. That all helps in discovering some aspect of yourself. It helps you discover, in this case, what is a life worthy of living. And I'm hopeful that you all do that. For me, I've been having, multiple, over 50 conversations now, and I've learned so much. I keep learning. And I see the power in this, and I didn't know that it would do this to me, but I'm seeing what it's doing to me, and it's beautiful. And I get to have lovely conversations with people like Victor, and I pray that you all gain some insight and learn from our conversation, but more importantly, that you go out and have these types of conversations yourself. Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. So are there any final words you would like to say to the audience before we sign off?
I love what you just said, to seek out conversations with each other out of a sense of curiosity, and to also, I think that, it keeps coming back, and this is it was hard for me, it's hard for so many, is to treat oneself as worthy of the most beautiful love, and to offer oneself that love, and to let that be a foundational practice, so that all the other things we do, all the practices, all the ways we engage, our relationships, flow from the abundance of that sense of love that we can offer ourselves, and can remind others around us that they are so deeply loved just for who they are, just for their beingness.
Absolutely beautiful, Victor. This has been divine, beyond words. Thank you so much, and looking forward to many more conversations in the future. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we will do this again on this podcast and explore the subjects, and really, really grateful for you and the work that you're doing in the world, and being a beacon of light and beauty and love in the world. It's just, you're an inspiration. Thank you.
Back at you. You are too. Thank you. Blessings.
Thank you so much for tuning into the show. I hope this conversation has inspired you to reflect on your own views of the good life. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more inspiring and thought-provoking conversations, please follow, write a review, and rate us on your favorite podcast app. If you are tuning in on YouTube, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support is very much appreciated.